Chapter 49 of Adam Bede. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 49. At the Hall Farm. The first autumnal afternoon sunshine of 1801, more than 18 months after that parting of Adam and Arthur in the Hermitage, was on the yard at the Hall Farm, and the bulldog was in one of his most excited moments, for it was that hour of the day when the cows were being driven into the yard for their afternoon milking. No wonder the patient beasts ran confusedly into the wrong places, for the alarming din of the bulldog was mingled with more distant sounds which the timid feminine creatures, with pardonable superstition, imagined also to have some relation to their own movements. With the tremendous crack of the waggoner's whip, the roar of his voice, and the booming thunder of the waggon, as it left the rickyard empty of its golden load. The milking of the cows was a sight Mrs. Poyser loved, and at this hour on mild days she was usually standing at the house door, with her knitting in her hands, in quiet contemplation, only heightened to a keener interest when the vicious yellow cow, who had once kicked over a pailful of precious milk, was about to undergo the preventive punishment of having her hinder legs strapped. To-day, however, Mrs. Poyser gave but a divided attention to the arrival of the cows, for she was in eager discussion with Dinah, who was stitching Mr. Poyser's shirt collars, and had borne patiently to have her thread broken 3 times by Totty pulling at her arm with a sudden insistence that she should look at baby, that is, at a large wooden doll with no legs and a long skirt, whose bald head Totty, seated in her small chair at Dinah's side, was caressing and pressing to her fat cheek with much fervour. Totty is larger by more than 2 years' growth than when you first saw her, and she has on a black frock under her pinafore. Mrs. Poyser, too, has on a black gown, which seems to heighten the family likeness between her and Dinah. In other respects, there is little outward change now discernible in our old friends, or in the pleasant house-place, bright and polished oak and pewter. "I never saw the like to you, Dinah," Mrs. Poyser was saying. "When you've once took anything into your head, there's no more moving you than the rooted tree. You may say what you like, but I don't believe that's religion. For what's the Sermon on the Mount about, as you're so fond o' reading to the boys, but doing what other folks ought to have you do? But if it was anything unreasonable they wanted you to do, like taking your cloak off and giving it to 'em, or letting 'em slap you in the face, I daresay you'd be ready enough. It's only when one you'd have you do what's plain common sense and good for yourself, as you're obstinate the other way." "Nah, dear aunt," said Dinah, smiling slightly, as she went on with her work, "I'm sure your wish 'ud be a reason for me to do anything that I didn't feel it was wrong to do." "Wrong? You drive me past bearing. What is there wrong, I should like to know? I staying along with your own friends, as are the happier for having you with 'em, and are willing to provide for you, even if your work didn't more nor pay 'em for the bit of sparrow's victual you eat and the bit of rag you put on. And who is it, I should like to know, as you're bound to help and comfort in the world more nor your own flesh and blood, and me, the only aunt you've got above ground, and am brought to the brink of the grave welly every winter as comes, and there's the child as sits beside you, you'll break her little heart when you go, and the grandfather not been dead a 12 month, and your uncle, who'll miss you so as never was, a lighting his pipe and waiting on him, and now I can trust you with the butter, and have all the trouble of teaching you, and there's all the sewing to be done, and I must have the strange girl out of Treddles on to do it, and all because you must go back to that bare heap of stones as the very crows fly over and won't stop at." "Dear Aunt Rachel," said Dinah, looking up in Mrs. Poyser's face, "it's your kindness makes you say I'm useful to you. You don't really want me now, for Nancy and Molly are clever at their work, and you're in good health now, by the blessing of God, and my uncle is of a cheerful countenance again, and you have neighbours and friends not a few, some of them come to sit with my uncle almost daily. Indeed, you will not miss me, and at Snowfield there are brethren and sisters in great need, who have none of those comforts you have around you. I feel that I am called back to those amongst whom my lot was first cast. I feel drawn again towards the hills where I used to be blessed in carrying the word of life to the sinful and desolate." "You feel, yes," said Mrs. Poyser, returning from a parenthetic glance at the cows. "That's always the reason I'm to sit down with when you're mind to do anything contrary. What do you want to be preaching for more than you're preaching now? Don't you go off, the Lord knows where, every Sunday, a preaching and praying? And haven't you got Methodists enow at Treddles on to go and look at, if church folks' faces are too handsome to please you? And isn't there them in this parish as you've got underhand, and they're like enough to make friends with old Harry again as soon as your back's turned? There's that Bessie Cranage, she'll be flaunting in new finery 3 weeks after you're gone, I'll be bound. She'll no more go on in her new ways without you than a dog'll stand on its hind legs when there's nobody looking. But I suppose it doesn't matter so much about folks' souls in this country, else you'd be for staying with your own aunt, for she's none so good but what you might help her to be better." There was a certain something in Mrs. Poyser's voice just then, which she did not wish to be noticed, so she turned round hastily to look at the clock, and said, "See there, it's tea time, and if Martin's in the rickyard he'll like a cup. Here, Totty, my chicken, let mother put your bonnet on, and then you go out into the rickyard and see if father's there, and tell him he mustn't go away again without coming to have a cup of tea, and tell your brothers to come in too." Totty trotted off in her flapping bonnet, while Mrs. Poyser set out the bright oak table and reached down the teacups. "You talk of them gells, Nancy and Molly, being clever in their work," she began again. "It's fine talking. They're all the same, clever or stupid. One can't trust 'em out of one's sight a minute. They want somebody's eye on 'em constant if they're to be kept to their work. And suppose I'm ill again this winter, as I was the winter before last, who's to look after them then, if you're gone? And there's that blessed child, something sure to happen to her. They'll let her tumble into the fire, or get at the kettle with the boiling lard in it, or something mischief as you'll lame her for life, and it'll be all your fault, Dinah." "Aunt," said Dinah, "I promise to come back to you in the winter if you're ill. Don't think I will ever stay away from you if you're in real want of me. But, indeed, it is needful for my own soul that I should go away from this life of ease and luxury, in which I have all things too richly to enjoy. At least, that I should go away for a short space. No one can know but myself what are in my inward needs, and the besetments I am most in danger from. Your wish for me to stay is not a call of duty which I refuse to hearken to because it is against my own desires. It is a temptation that I must resist, lest the love of the creature should become like a mist in my soul, shutting out the heavenly light. It passeth my cunning to know what you mean by ease and luxury, said Mrs. Poyser, as she cut the bread and butter. It's true there's good victual enough about you, as nobody shall ever say I don't provide enough and to spare. But if there's ever a bit of odds and ends as nobody else 'ud eat, you're sure to pick it out. But look there, there's Adam Bede a-carrying the little un in. I wonder how it is he's come so early." Mrs. Poyser hastened to the door for the pleasure of looking at her darling in a new position, with love in her eyes but reproof on her tongue. "Oh, for the shame, Totty! Little girls of 5-year-old should be ashamed to be carried. Why, Adam, she'll break your arm, such a big girl as that. Set her down, for shame." "Nah, nah," said Adam. "I can lift her with my hand. I've no need to take my arm to it." Totty, looking as serenely unconscious of remark as a fat white puppy, was set down at the door-place, and the mother enforced her reproof with a shower of kisses. "You're surprised to see me at this hour of the day," said Adam. "Yes, but come in," said Mrs. Poyser, making way for him. "There's no bad news, I hope?" "No, nothing bad," Adam answered, as he went up to Dinah and put out his hand to her. She had laid down her work and stood up. Instinctively, as he approached her, a faint blush died away from her pale cheek as she put her hand in his and looked up at him timidly. "It's an errand to you brought me, Dinah," said Adam, apparently unconscious that he was holding her hand all the while. "Mother's a bit ailing, and she set her heart on your coming to stay the night with her, if you'll be so kind. I told her I'll call and ask you as I came from the village. She overworks herself, and I can't persuade her to have a little girl to help her. I don't know what's to be done." Adam released Dinah's hand as he ceased speaking, and was expecting an answer, but before she had opened her lips, Mrs. Poyser said, "Look there now, I told you there was folks enow to help in this parish. Without going further off, there's Mrs. Bede, getting an old and casualty as can be, and she won't let anybody but you go a-nigh her hardly. The folks at Snowfield have learnt by this time to do better without you nor she can. I'll put my bonnet on and set off directly, if you don't want anything done first, aunt," said Dinah, folding up her work. "Yes, I do want something done. I want you to have your tea, child. It's all ready, and you'll have a cup, Adam, if you arena in too big a hurry." "Yes, I'll have a cup, please, and then I'll walk with Dinah. I'm going straight home, for I've got a lot of timber valuations to write out." "Why, Adam, lad, are you here?" said Mr. Poyser, entering warm and coatless, with the two black-eyed boys behind him, still looking as much like him as two small elephants are like a large one. "How is it we've got sight of you so long before foddering time?" "I came on an errand for mother," said Adam. "She's got a touch of her old complaint, and she wants Dinah to go and stay with her a bit." "Well, we'll spare her for your mother a little while," said Mr. Poyser, "but we won't spare her for anybody else, only her husband." "Husband!" said Marty, who was at the most prosaic and literal period of the boyish mind. "Why, Dinah hasn't got a husband." "Spare her," said Mrs. Poyser, placing a seed cake on the table, and then seating herself to pour out the tea. But we must spare her, it seems, and not for a husband neither, but for her own megrims. Tommy, what are you doing to your little sister's doll? Making the child naughty when she'd be good if you'd let her. You shanna have a morsel o' cake if you behave so." Tommy, with truly brotherly sympathy, was amusing himself by turning Dolly's skirt over her bald head and exhibiting her truncated body to the general scorn, an indignity which cut Totty to the heart. "What do you think Dinah's been a telling me since dinner time?" Mrs. Poyser continued, looking at her husband. "Ah, I'm poor an' at guessing," said Mr. Poyser. "Why, she means to go back to Snowfield again, and work in the mill and starve herself, as she used to do, like a creature as has got no friends." Mr. Poyser did not readily find words to express his unpleasant astonishment. He only looked from his wife to Dinah, who had now seated herself beside Totty, as a bulwark against brotherly playfulness, and was busying herself with the children's tea. If he had been given to making general reflections, it would have occurred to him that there was certainly a change come over Dinah, for she never used to change colour, but, as it was, he merely observed that her face was flushed at that moment. Mr. Poyser thought she looked the prettier for it. It was a flush no deeper than the petal of a monthly rose. Perhaps it came because her uncle was looking at her so fixedly, but there is no knowing, for just then Adam was saying, with quiet surprise, "Why, I hoped Dinah was settled among us for life. I thought she'd given up the notion of going back to her old country." "Thought? Yes," said Mrs. Poyser, "and so would anybody else have thought, as had got their right end upwards. But I suppose you must be a Methodist to know what a Methodist'll do. It's ill guessing what the bats are flying after." "Why, what have we done to you, Dinah, as you must go away from us?" said Mr. Poyser, still pausing over his tea cup. "It's like breaking your word. Well, if your aunt never had no thought but you'd make this your home." "Nah, uncle," said Dinah, trying to be quite calm. "When I first came, I said it was only for a time, as long as I could be of any comfort to my aunt." "Well, and who said you'd ever left off being a comfort to me?" said Mrs. Poyser. "If you didn't mean to stay with me, you'd better never ha' come. Them as have never had a cushion don't miss it." "Nah, nah," said Mr. Poyser, who objected to exaggerated views. "Thee mustn't say so. We shouldn't have been ill off without her. Lady Day was a 12-month. We mun be thankful for that, whether she stays or not. But I canna think what she mid leave a good home for, to go back in a country where the land, most on't, isn't worth 10 shillings an acre, rent and profits. Why, that's just the reason she wants to go, as far as she can give a reason," said Mrs. Poyser. "She says this country's too comfortable, and there's too much to eat, and folks arena miserable enough. And she's going next week. I canna turn her, say what I will. It's always the way with them meek-faced people. You may as well pelt a bag of feathers as talk to 'em. But I say, it isn't religion to be so obstinate, is it now, Adam?" Adam saw that Dinah was more disturbed than he had ever seen her by any matter relating to herself, and anxious to relieve her, if possible, he said, looking at her affectionately, "Nay, I can't find fault with anything Dinah does. I believe her thoughts are better than our guesses, let 'em be what they may. I should have been thankful for her to stay among us, but if she thinks well to go, I wouldn't cross her, or make it hard to her by objecting. We owe her something different to that. As it often happens, the words intended to relieve her were just too much for Dinah's susceptible feelings at this moment. The tears came into the grey eyes too fast to be hidden, and she got up hurriedly, meaning it to be understood that she was going to put on her bonnet. "Mother, what's Dinah crying for?" said Totty. "She isn't a naughty doll." "Thee's got a bit too far," said Mr. Poyser. "We've no right to interfere with her doing as she likes, and thee'st be as angry as could be with me if I said a word against anything she did." "Because you very like be finding fault without reason," said Mrs. Poyser. "But there's reason in what I say, else I shouldn't say it. It's easy talking for them as can't love her so well as her own aunt does. And me got so used to her, I shall feel as uneasy as a new sheared sheep when she's gone from me. And to think of her leaving a parish where she's so looked on. There's Mr. Irwine makes as much of her as if she was a lady, for all her being a Methodist, and with that maggot of preaching in her head. God forgive me if I'm in the wrong to call it so." "Ay," said Mr. Poyser, looking jocose, "but thee doesn't tell Adam what he said to thee about it one day. The missus was saying, Adam, as the preaching was the only fault to be found with Dinah, and Mr. Irwine says, 'But you mustn't find fault with her for that, Mrs. Poyser. You forgot she's got no husband to preach to.' I'll answer for it, you give Poyser many a good sermon. The parson had thee there," Mr. Poyser added, laughing unctuously. "I told Bartle Massey on it, and he laughed too." "Yes, it's a small joke sets men laughing when they sit a staring at one another with a pipe in their mouths," said Mrs. Poyser. "Give Bartle Massey his way, and he'd have all the sharpness to himself. If the chaff cutter had the making of us, we should all be straw, I reckon. Totty, my chicken, go upstairs to cousin Dinah, and see what she's doing, and give her a pretty kiss." This errand was devised for Totty as a means of checking certain threatening symptoms about the corners of her mouth, for Tommy, no longer expectant of cake, was lifting up his eyelids with his forefingers and turning his eyeballs towards Totty in a way that she felt to be disagreeably personal. "You're rare and busy now, eh, Adam?" said Mr. Poyser. "Burge's getting so bad with his asthmy, it's well if you'll ever do much riding about again." "Yes, we've got a pretty bit o' building on hand now," said Adam, "what with the repairs on the estate and the new houses at Treddleston. I'll bet a penny that new house Burge is building on his own bit o' land is for him and Mary to go to," said Mr. Poyser. "He'll be for laying his business soon, I'll warrant, and be wanting you to take it to all and pay him so much by the year. We shall see you living on the hill before another 12 months over." "Well," said Adam, "I should like to have the business in my own hands. It isn't as I mind much about getting any more money. We've enough and to spare now, with only our two selves and mother. But I should like to have my own way about things. I could try plans then, as I can't do now." "You get on pretty well with the new steward, I reckon," said Mr. Poyser. "Yes, yes, he's a sensible man enough, understands farming. He's carrying on the draining, and all that, capital. You must go some day towards the Stonyshire side and see what alterations they're making. But he's got no notion about buildings. You can so seldom get hold of a man as can turn his brains to more nor one thing. It's just as if they wore blinkers, like the horses, and could see nothing o' one side of 'em. Now, there's Mr. Irwine has got notions o' building more nor most architects, for as for the architects, they set up to be fine fellows, but the most of 'em don't know where to set a chimney so as it shan't be quarrelling with a door. My notion is, a practical builder that's got a bit of taste makes the best architect for common things, and I've 10 times the pleasure in seeing after the work when I've made the plans myself." Mr. Poyser listened with an admiring interest to Adam's discourse on building, but perhaps it suggested to him that the building of his corn rick had been proceeding a little too long without the control of the master's eye, for when Adam had done speaking, he got up and said, "Well, lad, I'll bid you good-bye now, for I'm off to the rickyard again." Adam rose too, for he saw Dinah entering, with her bonnet on and a little basket in her hand, preceded by Totty. "You're ready, I see, Dinah," Adam said, "so we'll set off, for the sooner I'm at home the better." "Mother," said Totty, with her treble pipe, "Dinah was saying her prayers and crying ever so." "Hush, hush," said the mother, "little girls mustn't chatter." Whereupon the father, shaking with silent laughter, set Totty on the white deal table and desired her to kiss him. Mr. and Mrs. Poyser, you perceive, had no correct principles of education. "Come back to-morrow, if Mrs. Bede doesn't want you, Dinah," said Mrs. Poyser, "but you can stay, you know, if she's ill." So, when the good-byes had been said, Dinah and Adam left the Hall Farm together. Chapter 49.